But it's time now for Uncancelled, where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. And breaking tonight, President Joe Biden has been condemned for smirking during a press conference after a day which saw at least 57 people killed and 169 wounded following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Biden's doddery and tone-deaf performance in front of the cameras this evening will offer no comfort to those hoping for a strong and coordinated response to Putin's act of war.
Did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did this summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, he was. I made it clear as an adversary, and I say he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's been through. Did you read that? I shouldn't have. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour-long speech of why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
Now, Putin's false belief that Ukraine is a made-up state that belongs to Russia is nothing new. But having a US president who has relinquished all authority on the international stage is new. And I'd say it's, frankly, a chilling development. The associate editor of The Spectator and author of The Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray, joins me now. Douglas, great talk, big day. Has Putin been enabled somehow by weak leadership in the White House?
I wouldn't say just the White House. Putin has chosen his moment very well. He's been amassing forces on the borders of the Ukraine for a year now. This started last March. He started to get as many as 90,000 troops on the borders. So none of this is new. He's been waiting and watching. Last summer, of course, he watched as America withdrew from Afghanistan, handed the country back over to the Taliban, leaving huge amounts of kit. Vladimir Putin well remembers the Soviet scurrying from Afghanistan, and he knew that it heralded Soviet weakness at the time in the 1980s. And he knew that the American scurry, the NATO scurry from Afghanistan, also heralded weakness. He knows one thing above all, which is that the West is deeply fearful of war. He's correct. The West is fearful of war for very good reason. But that calculation by him means that he knows all the time that he can take a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. That's what he did in 2008 in South Ossetia. That's what he did 8 years ago with the Crimea. And it's what he's trying to do now. But there's no doubt about it, I think, that the basic vacuum at the top of the West, in the White House, the position of the president, the position of the vice president, is a seriously encouraging factor for Vladimir Putin.
So, Douglas, how worried should we be? Because I listened to that speech in the early hours of this morning from Putin, and I do feel like he was invoking the possibility of nuclear war.
Yes, he was. It was an extraordinary speech. I mean, first of all, he rewrites the history, of course. I mean, his version of the history, and the thing that his stooges in the West say, is that sort of NATO provoked this. And indeed, this whole claim of sending peacekeepers in to Ukraine, as if Ukraine needs thuggish, heavily armed Russian so-called peacekeepers. It was just one extraordinary aspect of the speech. But yes, the very clear threat of the speech is that he says anyone who dares to stand in our way will feel repercussions that their worst nightmares. And of course, he knows that the West is highly unlikely to want to take the risk of crossing over the tripwire that Vladimir Putin has set up. And I think now the question is going to be how much of Ukraine he's going to try to take, how much of it he will take, whether he tries to take just part of the eastern areas that, I mean, I say just, but it's come to that, But whether he tries to take the eastern areas, the Russian-speaking areas, whether he tries to push on to Kiev and indeed take the whole country, if he tries to swallow the whole country, all sorts of things are going to happen. I would say that it's extremely hard to predict, obviously, but I would say that there's one thing that's very striking, which is I would be surprised if Vladimir Putin can afford a lengthy war in the Ukraine. That's even before we get onto the issue of the sanctions that are coming in, which is the absolute bare minimum that the Western states need to do at this stage. I would be surprised if even before those sanctions come in, Putin could afford a long war in the Ukraine. You know, the Russian economy is not doing well. The Russian economy is smaller than the size of the economy of South Korea, to give just one example. But of course, he spends massively on the military, for reasons that we've now just been reminded of. But whether or not he wants a long, drawn-out, protracted war, I would think not. He wants to move fast and take as much as he can. And as Biden quite accurately said, it does fit into a picture that he's told the West about for 3 decades. I mean, Condoleezza Rice remembers that when she was Secretary of State of the United States, she remembered being at a conference with Putin, indeed with NATO leaders, in which he referred to the Ukraine as not a country. And Condoleezza Rice said, we all sort of did a double take at the time. Did he really just say that? He said that. He's always thought that. He's always wanted to reform the Soviet Union. He pines for it like a lover pining for an ex. And this now, he's got to this stage of his career, you might say. Also, by the way, I mean, this is a man who's been sitting in the Kremlin for 2 years. He's had an extraordinarily strange attitude toward coronavirus. I mean, even now, nobody can get within feet of him without having spent weeks in isolation. So he's been sitting in the Kremlin brooding. He's coming up to his 70th birthday. There are all sorts of personal rumors around him. And he clearly thinks this is an attempt to assert his legacy. This is what he's going to give back. But of course, we see what that means in reality, because Ukraine is a country. It's not a figment of anyone's imagination. The Ukrainian people are a people. They have the right to defend themselves, the right not to be the subjects of unbelievable aggression by Vladimir Putin and his forces. But this is an extremely perilous moment, because Putin has read the West correctly. And that's one of the reasons why he's doing what he's doing.
Douglas Murray, fascinating analysis as ever from the author of The Madness of Crowds. Thank you so much, Douglas.